Hi, I'm Gary Ralph, and this is my coffee. And this is the beginning of another lecture in the series of lectures for History 101. And we are in the middle of talking about can't find the sheet, but it's the terrible 1300s. They were terrible. And there was the great schism that happened in the church as the result of the Avignon papacy, which I will be talking about at the beginning of my videos about the Reformation. But there was also this thing called the Hundred Years' War. Probably all of you have heard of the Hundred Years' War, though you may not have a very strong idea about what it all was about. I mentioned earlier that the Holy Roman Empire was neither Holy Roman nor an empire. And the thing is, the Hundred Years' War, to begin with, it didn't last just 100 years. As you can see from the years I gave, it's more than 100 years. Also, it wasn't really just one war, because it changed, as you might expect, very much over 100 years. And the war that was taking place in the mid 1400s was very different from the war that had been taking place towards the beginning of the 1300s. Theoretically, what the war was all about was that England and France had started fighting over control of this area that today we know of as northern France, which shows you who won the 100 Years' War, because it belonged to France. But this area of Normandy had been kind of what you might call contested territory. Remember, William the Conqueror had come from Normandy, and he was the one that had started the English series of kings and queens. So the English was the French, and then there had been Henry II, who had at least claimed title to large portions of northern and western France. So it wasn't like, if you had gone into a field in northern France and said to one of the peasants plowing the land, who exactly is in charge? And the peasant might say, well, there's that guy up on the hill over there. And if I do my work, he's going to get after me. No. Who is the person who is the king of the territory that you rule over? There's some guy, I don't know. So there weren't these at the beginning of the 100 Years' War, there weren't these very strong national attitudes where you would say, okay, up to this point, up to this border that you can draw on a map, everything's English, and then beyond that, everything's French. These were areas where there was different people who claimed to be in control, but they were fighting with each other. However, it was not just about that. During this long period of time, most of the important kings and governments in Europe pitched in at one point or another, because they thought they could get something out of it, because they were taking sides with one or another. So it wasn't just England fighting against France, and it wasn't just over where England stops and France begins. And that made it complicated, because there was an excellent historian named Jean Froissart who wrote a book called the Chronique, or the Chronicles. And his dates are, he was born around 1337 and he died around 1410. So he was writing during the kind of beginning and middle of the 100 Years' War. But as he points out, it's a war that stops and starts. The English king and the French, and it goes on long enough that we take several English kings and several French kings, and every once in a while they sign a truce. And whether this is a real attempt at peace or it's just, giving themselves some time to catch their breath, during that time, the people who have been fighting for them are professional soldiers. They're what we would call soldiers of fortune. I actually have this as number 2 of the ways in which this is a distinction of the 100 Years' War. But the people who were fighting in the 100 Years' War were not people who had any sworn loyalty to a particular ruler. I talked earlier about how you had this relationship between the lord and the vassal that was not primarily a commercial relationship. It was not an employer and employee situation, because there wasn't enough money running around Europe to be able to make it possible for an employer to pay an employee. But by the 1300s, that had changed. There was, in fact, a lot of money, and people and kings, if they wanted to start a war, they just hung out a sign saying, soldiers wanted good pay, and these people would show up and hire to be mercenaries. And that was really their profession. When I say mercenaries, that doesn't mean that they were people who were greedy and wanted lots of money. It just means that they were people whose profession was soldier, and they worked for the money. However, for instance, there came to be a time when the English and the French had signed a truce, however temporary, these soldiers were out of luck because nobody's paying them to be soldiers. There was no such thing yet as the idea that you could maintain an army in peacetime. If you hired an army, you paid them to fight, and when they stopped fighting, you stopped paying them. So a lot of these people became sort of soldiers on their own, soldiers taking the individual initiative. When they weren't actually fighting for a king, they would be going around the European countryside, capturing people and holding them for ransom, or besieging towns and then making the people in the town pay a certain amount of money. So even when the war, so to speak, was not technically going on, the people were still suffering because the soldiers were not able to make their living any other way, so they decided to go on being soldiers. One of the things we talk about in military history is the idea of the control of the means of violence, the idea that governments have the ability to start and stop violence, that it's not just something that somebody decides, I'm going to start killing people. It has to be something that the government can start, and then after it's achieved its goals, it can stop. This hasn't really been formulated in the 100 Years' War. These soldiers are only nominally under the control of their governments. And that's one of the things that makes it really difficult for Europeans during the 100 Years' War, is that it's not really a war it starts out at the beginning of the 100 Years' War being a war between individuals. A particular king of France fights a particular king of England, and theoretically all of the soldiers are supposed to be fighting for those individuals. But even though those individuals stop fighting for a while, the war continues. And people continue to suffer. One of the things we have to figure out as we move into the modern era is how to control this, control of the means of violence, so that people who are starting wars can stop them again. One way this happens is, of course, is that governments start paying armies in peacetime so that the soldiers will still have a job and they will not go out and start pillaging the cities. Another way in which the 100 Years' War is a new kind of war has to do with changes in the way that wars are fought. And this is partly technological. There has been technological innovation throughout the history of warfare. At the beginning of the class, I talked to you about hoplite warfare, which involved use of this kind of shield called the hoplon. And there continued to be innovations and additions to the technology of warfare. Several important things show up in 100 Years' War, either for the first time, such as gunpowder weapons, or things that people had been using before but had never been used in quite such a thorough fashion. The French started using this thing called the crossbow. If you are fighting with a bow and arrow, the further back you pull the bowstring, the harder the arrow will come out with more force when you let the string go. But the fact is that human physical ability can only pull the string back so far. And if you can pull the string back even farther, then, that's a great perspective shot, isn't it? You'd be able to shoot the arrow farther. So there are these machines called cranakins that they attach to a bow, which can literally crank. You crank the cranakin and it pulls the string back further than you could physically do it with your own strength. And then there is literally a trigger, like the trigger on a gun, that you pull, and bammo! That arrow shoots very fast, very forcefully, goes a long distance, can go through metal armor. So the French are using that. Meanwhile, the English are using something called the longbow. The other way in which you can get an arrow to fly farther is by there being more of a distance between one end of the bow and the other. It's just literally a bigger bow. And although, as I say, this is limited by this amount of physical strength you would have to pull this, the English have been training for decades to use these big, long bows. So you've got a lot of strong English bowmen who are able to use the longbow. So you've got these battles where literally the arrows that are coming from both sides are casting shadows on the ground because there's so many arrows going through the ground that they block out the sun. There is this third category of a mixture of sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal. Is what we have come to refer to as gunpowder. And it had been invented pretty clearly a couple of centuries before in China. But the Chinese had never really gotten the idea of putting something into a tube and then using that powder they'd invented to shoot the projectile out of the tube very forcefully. So they hadn't really ever invented the gun. And it's not really correct to call what they invented gunpowder. But somehow when this powder makes it to Europe, people have the idea of doing precisely that. There are early cannon, which are basically long tubes that are closed off at one end, and people put a little bit of gunpowder into it, and a projectile, and then they set the gunpowder on fire, and it shoots the gun. Makes a lot of noise. You can't really aim it at any particular thing in this early history of the firearm, but it makes a heck of a noise, and it scares the pants off of the opposition, which is, I guess, an objective. Whether the gunpowder weapons were used during the 100 Years' War is an interesting question. There are references in manuscripts of Froissart's chronicles that say, oh, this was the battle at which gunpowder was first used. But usually this has been written into the manuscript. It's not something that the original scribe who compiled the manuscript did. And, it's only a fleeting reference. So is this something that somebody a couple of centuries later said, oh, this must have been the battle where they first started using cannon, and I'll just write this in just to make everything complete. We don't really see a lot of gunpowder weapons. In fact, we don't see the kind of firearm that you would use, that a single person could use, until the beginning of the 1500s. So the actual use of gunpowder weapons as a kind of game changer doesn't really happen during the 100 Years' War, but we do have some evidence that it was used, and it didn't, contrary to popular belief, the introduction of gunpowder weapons didn't change everything. It started changing things when people started thinking, oh, we can use these gunpowder weapons to fight a different kind of war, where instead of taking people captive and holding them a ransom, we could just kill as many people as we want to, and that will be our way of winning the war. But that entailed a shift in conceptualization of what a war is for, and a shift in the goals that you were trying to achieve. The third thing that makes the 100 Years' War interesting is that people started to fight for new reasons. As I pointed out, at the beginning of the war, it was individuals fighting individuals, really. Some king of some country would fight some king of some other country, and if this king decided to fight the other guy, the king would send a message down saying, there's a war on, put on your war stuff. Don't ask questions. You don't really need to know why the war is taking place, but you're my subjects, and I have the right to tell you to put on your war stuff and go to fight. And for the first part of the war, this isn't going so well for the French. In fact, the English have some very substantial victories. The Shakespeare, a couple of centuries later, wrote one of his great plays, Henry V, about a very substantial victory that the English had over the French. And it looked like the English were winning, and that the northern part of what we call France would have become part of England. But then there's this woman, young girl, really, named Jeanne d'Arc, who wears men's clothing and has these visions, in which she claims God speaks to her, and she goes in front of the soldiers and says, "We can't let this happen because we are French. This is the nation of France, and we cannot let these English people, these foreigners, come into France and take control of our land of France." And she inspires the French to turn the war around. And as I pointed out at the beginning, the French end up winning, and that northern territory is now part of France. But it's an interesting difference because, as I pointed out, a lot of these people who lived in this territory probably didn't consider themselves. They considered themselves to be under the control of some king, but not necessarily because they were French. And the idea, I suggest that this is where you begin to see the idea of patriotism. There had been a kind of patriotism in the Roman Empire. People had sworn allegiance to the emperor, but it was also a matter of, we are part of the big Roman Empire. And now this idea begins to emerge again, actually, in the 1400s, the idea that we fight for you not because you are our king, not because you have the power to control us and force us to do these things, but because we are French people, and French people fight for France. Becomes a very important idea. It has something to do with the rise of the idea of the state, of this government that, kings may come and kings may go, but the state exists forever. And the state is what really controls you. The state is the institution in which you pay your taxes. And the state never goes away. So people begin to have their loyalty to this abstract idea of the state. Instead of the French king, they are loyal to France. And that's another step in which we see the modern world emerging. Okay, continue later.